Hello and welcome to Behind the Mic from OTRGold.com. I'm your host, Austin Bach. I recently had the pleasure of speaking with a living legend of old-time radio. Born in Laredo, Texas on September 15th, 1925, my guest started her career at age 2.5, performing during intermissions in silent movie theaters. She began working in radio at age 11 and by 18 was writing, producing, and directing early television shows. She's worked with Orson Welles, Alfred Hitchcock, Cecil B. DeMille, and countless other iconic figures in Hollywood. Among her many thousands of radio credits, she appeared in over 100 Dragnet episodes, playing Ma Friday and many other characters. She is the founder and director of the California Artists Radio Theater, which for more than 30 years has presented dramas, comedies, and musicals featuring renowned actors from all over the world. She celebrated her 99th birthday late last year, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Miss Peggy Webber. Miss Webber, thank you for speaking with me today.
And I'm very happy to be here.
This is truly an honor. I started a YouTube channel where we stream episodes of Dragnet 3 times a week, and members of my audience kept calling out and typing your name in the comments whenever they heard you pop up as different characters.
Yeah.
And happened so frequently that I also got tuned to your voice and could tell it as well. And the fun thing is you never know where you're going to appear. Sometimes it says Ma Friday, but other times it's you're the perpetrator, you're the victim, you appear everywhere. So
Well,
it's a pleasure.
I think Jack and I met each other at the right time. I met him when I was working on a show with his to-be wife, Julie London. We were working on a show that featured Eddie Firestone, and I'm trying to remember the name of the series. It was a comedy series on Mutual, and I had just come. We'd rehearsed a little bit, and then we had a break, and Julie wanted to introduce me to someone, and so she pulled me down to the footlights, and she called, and this young man showed up. He looked like a college boy. He had red socks on. He had a kind of college boy cardigan sweater. And he stood down in the orchestra pit and met me, put his hand up to the stage and shook hands with me. And she said that she enjoyed working with me and she wanted me to know him, and that he did a show in San Francisco. Well, I didn't know anything about him. I'd never heard of his show. I didn't know that the show was a success in San Francisco, but I thought they were a very nice couple. And when I looked out during the break, the rehearsal break, I saw that they were hugging and kissing each other. And so I felt that it was pretty imminent that they were going to get married. But I didn't find out about that until later. And I was working on a suspense show on CBS, and Jack turned out to be the lead on the show, and I was a French spy, a girl that this fellow falls in love with. He's an American citizen, but is working with the government. And so the story is about how the two of them get to know each other. And he really loves her, but his duty is to kill her, to shoot her, because she's a dangerous spy. So that was our first meeting where we got to do anything opposite each other.
Well, so
I thought it turned out very well. I thought that the killing was very tragic, and yet you knew that he had to do it. So,
I was about to ask what the outcome of that was.
yes,
I'm a
yeah,
fan of
yeah,
suspense, but
yeah,
I hadn't heard that episode yet. I've written it down. We'll have to go look it up.
yeah.
But
Well, it was kind of heart-wrenching for us too, because at first we were very cold with each other, and then we got very warm with each other, and then we sang some songs together, and we got to know each other pretty well. And then he finally, in the narration, says, "I knew that I had no choice. It was a job I had accepted, and I had to go through with it." And so you hear the gunshot, and the music starts. So that's it. So
wow.
after that, we worked quite frequently on This Is Your FBI, which was
Right.
a show done by Jerry Devine. And we usually completed about 9 o'clock. He said, "Pego, can you hang around till midnight? I'm trying out a new show with the executives at the top floor here at NBC." And I said, "Of course, Jack, I'd be delighted to help you." And so he said, "It may be boring. You have to sit around and wait until 12 o'clock. That's when we're going to do it." And so I said, "That'll be fine. That's fine." And so he said, "I know you do early morning shows, so you get here at 6 o'clock in the morning. It's a long day for you." I said, "Yeah, it's fine. It's fine." And so when we finally did get together at 12 o'clock, there were really no, I think he had given them a group of scripts to choose from upstairs with the executive producers and so on. And so they'd chosen a show that didn't really have much of a part for a female. It was just a vocal, on a car, a police car radio. So all I had to do was some voices like that. But I was happy to stay. And at the end of the recording, all the group of people who'd come were sitting upstairs in the sponsors booth, and they were so joyous, and they were all screaming and hollering, "Oh, it's great, it's great," And so I knew the show was probably accepted. So
Wow.
everybody left, but Jack said, "Peggy, stick around, I want to talk to you." And so,
This is now at like 1 a.m. in the morning.
yeah, yeah, 1:30, 2 o'clock.
1:30. Okay.
Yeah. And so I went over to the sound table, just leaned against it, stood there waiting for him. And he came over and he says, "They like it. I think they're going to do it. Can I sign you to a contract?" And I said, "Gee, Jack, you don't have to do that. I'd be happy to work for you anytime you asked me." And he looked at me and his eyes turned around in his head and he said, "Oh, well, okay." And he stuck the contract back in his pocket and went over to talk to some other people. So he was angry with me that I wasn't pleased that I was going to be under contract. But that wasn't the point. I just wanted him to know that I would work for him anyway.
Oh
But
man.
it did. So I went off, and a couple of days went by, and I thought I might hear from him, and I didn't. So I called his secretary, who was a girl I knew, and I told her what had happened and that I wanted him to know that I would be delighted if he still wanted me. And so about 15 or 20 minutes went by and the phone rang, and it was Jack. And he said, "You know damn well I want you." And I asked you, and "Do you want to sign a contract?" And I said, "Well, not really, because I don't think it's fair to you." I think, I'll work for you. I give you my word. I'll work for you anytime you call me. So he
Wow.
said, well, okay, see you next Thursday. And that was the way it started. So we recorded the first Dragnet about 5 days later.
Wow. So what was that first script that you did as kind of a pilot for the executives? Was that ever redone as part of the full series? And do you remember which episode that was?
Well, the first one was nothing. It was just a voice on the car, the police car, you know.
Right, but sorry, but the full story. Do you remember what the full story was?
No, I don't, because it really
Okay.
wasn't a story that you'd remember. It's,
Oh,
it's
okay.
just a very average kind of story. I don't think that I would recall that first one because they
Okay.
played the one that I was on, and I thought that I was finished with him. I thought he was angry with me and I would never see him again, but they played that as the first show. So
Oh, really?
I think that
So
was
your pilot
the
sorry.
pilot was the first show.
Oh, wow.
So, and I don't remember what the second one was, but it was a good part. I know that he gave me a good part. He always gave me the best parts. He he
Well,
was
that's
he was my favorite director because he knew what I could do, and he'd always give me the part that was right for me.
well, what you can do seems to be many number of things. So it was probably a delight to work with you as well back in the time. You can play old and young.
Well, I
Um,
played children. I played little boys with BB guns, things like that. You know, those stories. But I did enjoy playing Ma Friday. I think it was the most fun of any regular part that I ever played.
well, I've got some questions prepped about that character, but I would like to actually start back just a bit because your career spans an incredible range of roles from television,
Yeah,
theater,
yes,
radio, and film.
yeah.
And I wanted to ask you if you had a favorite medium, and if yes, why?
Well, I think it is radio, but I didn't really come alive until I was on stage. When I was on stage, I did work I was proud of.
Now, is that because you were on stage as a very young child? Are you talking about
Might, might,
after you've
it might be. I don't know. I know. I remember that very first. The orchestra was big, and they pushed me in the wings and said, "It's your turn. Go on." And I heard this wonderful music, and I thought, "Oh, how lucky I am! I'm getting to hear this wonderful music." And I went on and sang my song and did my dance, and that was the people clapped, and I loved that. And I went off, and my mother and father were there. And they took me to have a milkshake, and I had a good time. That was the
that's
way
great.
that was.
And they wanted you to sign you to wanted to sign you to a contract, and you said, "No, I work for milkshakes."
The milkshake was always a
Okay.
chocolate milkshake.
Oh, nice. Great. What were some of the unique challenges and rewards of working in radio as compared to film or television or
Well,
stage?
it was good for me at that age because I was very young. I was 16 when I got my first break in network radio. And if I could only play teenagers, I wouldn't work very often. But I needed to work. My father had died, and my mother and I were living on a very slim amount of money, and I had to keep working. And so I made sure that the directors knew that I could do older parts and I could do little boys and I could do all kinds of parts with different accents.
Now that you mentioned that you also did the Little Boys with BB Guns, were you one of the boys in the, 22
Yes,
Rifle for Christmas
yes,
episode that they
yeah,
did over and over?
yeah, yeah,
And I guess there's 2 boys in the
yes,
story,
there
but
were
there's
2
really only
boys.
1 boy that does the
Right,
talking. That was
right,
a role that you
right.
played?
Yeah, I was the bigger part, yeah.
Wow. Now what
Later, when I married a doctor who was in the Korean War, and I told him I would come over for, I think it was 2 weeks, and so during that time, he told me he would divorce me if I went back. So I
Mm,
had to end all of my contracts that I did have at that point. But that was quite a few years later. That
I'm sorry to
was
hear that.
that was just before Jack started the television series. He was doing Dragnet as a television show, and he'd already given me the part that he was going to give me to play on television. That was the Mexican woman who stole the baby.
Oh, yeah. I remember that episode, and I remember when that character started talking, that is Peggy Webber. I
That's
recognized
Mom Friday.
the voice. Yeah.
I failed.
That Ma Friday. No, but, it after a while, you start listening for, just your unique voice, and
Yeah.
it's a fun game to play. Find Peggy
Well,
Webber in the Dragnet episode.
actually, I, I did I did come home 4 months after I went to Japan, and it was, I think my husband realized that I had worked very hard to have a career and that he knew that I was doing this kind of work when I married him. And so it was something that we didn't say anything about it, but he said he thought it was better that I go home. And
Hmm.
that was it.
Well, so you touched on this story a bit, but I read through your interview with your neighbor Cliff. He posted like a
Yeah.
six-parter on, and you talked a lot about your history and things like that. So that some of these questions I have are follow-ups to things that you've shared with him. And you mentioned already that you initially met Jack when while working on another show with Julie London. Um, but, but that it wasn't until you were working on This Is Your FBI that you worked together.
Yes, that's right.
Um, do do you remember how you landed your part on This Is Your FBI?
Well, I'd always worked with Jerry Devine ever since he came to Hollywood. He came from New York, and I was told that this new producer, who was well known for many of the famous shows about police detectives and so on, uh, was going to be holding interviews. So I made an interview with him. He told me I looked like my hat was bigger than I was when I came to the interview. And he said that he would always remember me as that 16-year-old girl, you know, and he liked me enough that he hired me at least every 4 weeks to play a leading part on This Is Your FBI.
Wow, that's great. Switching back to Dragnet for a minute, what was it like creating these shows? Were the voice actors in one section and you had the sound effects people in a different section, or were you all in the same
Well,
group? Like, what was the
the
production?
people who had speaking parts were all in one room. At one time, the orchestra was separate from us, but then later, when we had a sponsor, they brought the orchestra into the room with us. So I'm not sure
Now,
how that worked, but
why was that? Do you know?
usually if a show was a successful show, and if it was very artistic, if people were concerned about it being as perfect as possible, they would keep the orchestra in another room. But with us, we had the orchestra right underneath us all the time. And when I'd get up to go to the microphone, I'd have to be very careful not to trip over anybody's instruments or whatever.
Now, what about the Foley artists? Were
Well,
they?
well, to begin with, Jack had to talk to all of the actors and tell them not to do what they'd been taught to do in radio. And that was to stand back like 3 or 4 feet from the microphone and say your lines so that the engineer has to overhear you. It has to sound like somebody's just overhearing the conversation. Now, he didn't do that with narrators, but he did do that with actors. And it was something he decided was going to be his trademark. That was the thing that Jack knew whether he was going to keep you as an actor with him or not. And the two of us had similar thoughts. And I didn't like actors sounding like they were being actors. And I thought he was on the right track.
So how would you describe the mood of the set typically? Was it
Well,
pretty?
for Jack to be in, to be a comrade with him, he didn't go for a lot of theatrics. He didn't enjoy that. He didn't believe that was part of the game. He felt that it should surprise the audience as they put the story together themselves, what it was coming to, what it was going to amount to. He didn't want you to know the story before it came to it.
Right. But what was it pretty laid back, or was it pretty serious on
Yeah,
set?
yeah.
Was it-
He he would, he didn't have to correct me very much because he was doing what I already thought should be the way we were doing. But with actors who had been in the business since 1930 or something like that, they were listening to their voices, and he didn't like that. He would get really good actors, but they were of a different cut. They wanted to sound like they were just being overheard. That was the way Jack wanted it, and they wanted to give it tonal qualities.
And so why was your approach different than the others? Because if your first radio job was at age 16, by the
Yes.
time Dragnet started, you're 24. So you've been
Well,
in the business.
I think he hit the same notes that I felt. I think the war had something to do with it. I think the old time actors would hold their hands up to their ears to listen to their voices and things like that. So he had a hard time getting them to do his style. And when he finally broke them in, then it became popular with other people.
Yeah, has it surprised you how big Dragnet eventually became? I mean, it's
I
spawning.
was in Japan for 2 weeks. My husband told me I only had to stay for 2 weeks. And I heard the Dragnet music playing in a little funky Japanese store. And I ran to the thing to hear it. And I thought, oh, isn't this wonderful? It's being heard in Japan. And, but the Japanese didn't get the what was happening. They didn't really know about it. And
What
it just surprised me that we were being heard all over the world.
was that
And
a
I think gradually it did change everybody's kind of way of
Oh
thinking.
yeah, it's iconic now. The
Yeah.
approach, the soundtrack, all of it.
Yeah. Oh, the only time I ever heard Jack really lose his temper was with the sound effects people. And these were good friends of all of ours because almost every show, it was broken up into, groups of like two actors, two sound effects men with 6 or 8 actors. So we got to know the sound effects people pretty well. And he was laying into Bud Tollefson and another fellow that was with him. And all of us were seated at a table for 6. And Virginia Gregg was there, and 2 or 3 of the regulars that were usually in the show. And we're kind of embarrassed because we've never heard him get that angry with anybody. And he's taking them to City Hall to run up and down stairs at 1 or 2 in the morning so that he could get the sound of what it sounds like when police are running up and down the stairs. And they aren't getting it. They went with him downtown, but somehow they just didn't record it properly.
Oh,
And so he's very upset. He's saying, "Can't you understand what I'm trying to do here?" And he's shouting and screaming at them. And everybody's being very quiet over the table. And we're feeling very sorry for Bud Thompson.
that was rare. You say that he had outbursts like that, right? Or I said outbursts. I don't mean to characterize it, but
He was not a director who lost his temper readily. He lost his temper once with me when I was playing a librarian, and I felt the librarian should speak quietly the way librarians should speak. And he kept, it was on a television show, and so he was trying to get me to move around and speak at the same time. And so he got pretty angry with me. And I said, "Jack, a librarian wouldn't speak louder. I can't speak louder. She would speak quietly. She's setting an example for everybody else in the room. She can't speak louder." "I don't know what you're talking about. You're off mic. You're supposed to be off mic." So that was the one time that he and I had a kind of trouble. But that
and
was on television. That was not radio.
well, and how did it end? Who got their way?
Well, we got back together. We got over it. We didn't pay any attention to it.
No, but I mean, when it's recorded, was it a quiet librarian
Yeah,
or a
I
noisy
don't think. I
librarian?
think it was kind of a. I was cutting it down the middle, trying to please
Okay,
both him and me.
nice.
But I've only seen that one time, and I thought, well, it's okay. That was the way I felt about it.
Now, I have a question about yours.
I did about 100 of the radio shows
Yeah.
before I went to Japan.
Now,
When I went to Japan, he was a little ticked off with me for that.
now, were you under contract for more? I mean, you mentioned not having signed a contract at the beginning or not wanting to.
Well, yeah,
Uh,
he wanted to contract with me, but I didn't push it after that.
okay, so
He didn't bring it up again.
oh,
So,
so you were never under like official contract. You just
well, he said, to me, "I want you on the show, and I wouldn't give you a running part if I didn't want you on the show." Yeah. So that was about all that was said.
okay. Now, how much improv was uh, how much improv took place in these stories or in these episodes? You just mentioned now you had conversations from time to time about how a character um, would act in certain situations, but
Mm.
was did most everyone stick to the script often, or did people
Well,
throw in ad
he
lib
talked to
lines?
me when Julie was having her first baby. They married at Herb Ellis's house in San Francisco, and when she was delivering their first child, we had all been together for about a year at that point. And he said to he said, Julie's in labor right now. But the doctor she went to, she's not taking any medicine to kill the pain. She's just having the baby. I said,
Superwoman.
well, that's pretty popular right now, and she'll be fine. She's a smart girl. So he said, oh, I hope to God. He went on. We were ready to do the show while he was talking to me like that.
Wow. Um,
And I was after he died. Some people that worked with him on stage, not a stage play, but maybe a presentation of a medal or something like that. He'd met people like that, and they had become good friends, and they'd phone me every once in a while. We'd talk about Jack, and I remember that he had two daughters, not both at the same time, but they were about 2 years apart. And after he died, I said to one of these people, it's too bad he didn't have a boy. He always wanted a boy. And I did believe he was brought up as a single child by his mother and his grandmother. And I was trying to give him memories of his mother and his grandmother when I played Ma Friday, because I knew that was the only kind of home that he had. He was always a popular person. He was the president of his student body at the high school and whatever other schools he went to. He was always the person everybody followed. But when these people told me that they had found his father and had found that he had 3 or 4 brothers, I said, oh, isn't that sad that he didn't know that he had brothers? Because he really wanted brothers. He wished he had a family. He wished he had brothers. And this was something that was so sad to me
so
because I knew how he felt.
so people had discovered this after he'd passed away, that he had uh so you're saying two of his biological kids or his children.
They were
um
daughters. He loved them,
Mhm.
and he'd go swim with them even after
Yep.
they were divorced. And he introduced her future husband to her, to Julie. And when I came home from Japan and was living here, now I guess it was my husband came with me. We went to see Julie London sing her song, song that she made famous after they were divorced. And it was Cry Me a River, and she was
Okay.
in a nightclub performing. And my husband and I went to see her. And the next morning, I had to work for Jack. So I told him when he walked in, he came in kind of late. And I said, Jack, I saw Julie last night. She was singing and she was very good. She has a sweet voice. He said, she has a little voice. That was his comment. And at that
I mean,
point, he was
that's
dating
pretty.
Peggy Lee. He was dating Peggy Lee. That's what broke up the marriage, I guess, was him falling in love with Peggy Lee.
I have a question for you on the rehearsing for these shows. What was the rehearsal schedule like? Let's talk specifically
4 hours.
about Dragnet.
4 hours.
4 hours, and would you get that a week in advance, or and
Well,
then?
usually all of us were working other shows, so
Mhm.
he was aware of that. I came in at 6 in the morning for a soap opera. And then I did another soap opera at 8 o'clock. And I did afternoon shows. So we usually didn't start rehearsing until 3, something like that, 3 in the afternoon.
For a 7 o'clock showtime?
And so if it was a difficult show, which most of them now were carved out just for the people who were going to be playing in them. I mean, Jack had everybody set up so they knew what they were doing after they read the script through one time. That was all. We'd read it around the table one time. Then he'd start working with the sound effects, and he'd go in and deal with the engineer. And all of
That
us
sounds
would go to
ominous.
our corners.
You say he'd go in and deal with the engineer. Sounds like
Yeah.
wouldn't want to be the engineer in that case.
Yeah, I think it was something concrete that he could deal with.
Okay.
You know? And I'd usually go sit in the front rows of the theater seats. It was always in a big theater where we did this. We were at Studio 1 and no A, and then we moved to B. And once or twice we were at the small studios, H and G. But everybody pretty much knew their place, knew what Jack expected of them. And then we'd run the show through with a dress rehearsal. Sometimes later, when we were doing it on tape, we just do it one time. So it was, I thought the show suffered from that. I thought that it was better when we did a dress and then did the show.
Well, so Ted, were you gonna say something?
Not
I was gonna say, when you thought it was better when you did it live rather than recorded. Is that what you were saying?
Well, no. Although we
'Cause
we did do recordings later, and I thought we were better when we were live. But that is true. But for the first few times when I came back from Japan, he made us go through the rehearsal. But later, everybody was so accustomed to the style that we do one read through, then we'd record it, and then they'd play the recording of it, and that bothered me. I thought we were better when we were live.
Okay, so to help kind of set the context, at some point you had the I don't know if the full radio history yet, but you had an East Coast network and a West Coast, or East Coast Showtime, West Coast Showtime. Was there ever
the orchestra also was with us for quite a while, and then later it was in another room.
Okay, but you're recording in Los Angeles, so would your dress rehearsal? How would the East Coast broadcast happen? Would you just record
3 hours difference. Yeah.
right? But would you so you get the script. If you can just kind of walk me through, if you can remember the order of things, you get the script the day of performance. You get it 4 hours early. You do a read. You do a table
We
read.
did. We did. When tape became popular,
Mm-hmm.
like Jerry Devine's show, This Is the FBI, we usually did that about 6 o'clock of California time, and it was played in New York at that hour because it would
So
be
it went live at 9 p.m. then,
yeah,
right?
it'd be 3 hours difference. So
Mhm.
we'd play at New York. Then we'd come back and do the show live here.
At 9 p.m. again, or
That was
whenever
that
the
was just in the very early days of recording and making CDs of the shows. The same thing applied to Dragnet. That's when we lost the orchestra. When the orchestra was with us was during that interim period. I guess what they did was take the recording of the stuff and put it in for the second show.
Okay.
Because the orchestra always was playing the live music at least one time.
Okay. And how did that process change when Dragnet became a TV show? Like, how much advance notice were you given the
Well, as
scripts?
I recall it, we did the Big Mother at 12 o'clock at night
Oh, wow.
during the Christmas holidays. And Julie came in with hot food for everybody, wearing a big fur coat, carrying all kinds of boxes and satchels and everything. Fed us all a hot, Christmassy kind of dinner. And we ate on the stage, wherever we could find a place to sit down next to a table or be comfortable.
And that was when filming the Big Mother episode of the TV show?
Yeah, we'd be. I played the shows on air, on radio, and then would repeat some of them when we did them for film.
Great. Now, how much input did you have on the creation of the character? You mentioned Ma Friday trying to draw inspiration from the
Yeah,
women in Jack Webb's life.
it was my mother and what I heard about his mother,
Mhm.
because he would tell me little jokes about his mother, and he loved his mother very much because he felt she'd gone through an awful lot. But she evidently told him that his father was a musician and that he was traveling all the time with his orchestra. And therefore, he began to be very fond of playing, pieces of. He'd make a story like the movies that he made, where he was a young man with a horn. I forget the names of those movies, but he liked to visualize that his dad was a musician. And I think that's why he fell in love with Peggy Lee. He was thinking that was the world he probably belonged in, that kind of thing.
Now, a question for you on the inspiration for Ma Friday. Whose mother was it? Yours,
Yes,
or
both my mother and his mother
right?
were
But
very
which?
much. Tim Moser wrote the scripts for that. And when
The
I came back from Japan, the time that I came back once for Christmas and then returned and then later
right.
came back. So uh, I'm getting myself mixed up.
I think he's wanting to know what the women in your life were like that inspired Ma
Oh,
Friday's
oh,
personality?
Yeah,
yes.
with two
characteristics?
Yeah.
specific questions.
Well,
That's right, Ted.
I had a boyfriend that I didn't really like very much, and his mother was the kind of person who was always acting very good, but she was a hypocrite. And I'd never said this to anybody, but she had this cute little way of, talking to her boys where she'd say, "Oh, I like it very much. This is wonderful." But it wasn't wonderful. It wasn't something she liked. So I used that, and my mother would cook dinner, and I wouldn't come home, and she would have this roast and everything, and so I told Jim Moser my mother would get upset when I'd come home at midnight and she'd been waiting dinner for me. So
That's
it would be, she'd say, "Well, I had nice roast beef." And
exactly.
this is what Ma Friday said to Dad.
That was the part I was going to ask about, because I
He
also have a
sat
mother
there.
that
He
will.
sat there. The tears would be running down his face while the show would be playing in New York. And I'd think, if he doesn't stop that, I'm gonna start breaking up myself.
Yeah, that's one of the characteristics of Ma Friday that I laugh about every time. Is
Yeah.
she's always trying to feed him, no matter what time it is. He comes in at 2 a.m. She's downstairs stuffing food in his face, and I have a mother that's very much like that. So it makes me smile when I hear that. So that was your mother.
She makes him feel guilty about it, like,
Yeah.
I had this food ready for you, and you must be so hungry. No, you're gonna eat it. She's just
That's right.
she just uses the mother's
It was
guilt.
very good.
Yeah. Yes, it's very good. Exactly. Oh man, that's funny. So, of all the characters you played on Dragnet, did you have a favorite?
Well, I think the Mexican woman was. I think that show kind of hit home with a lot of people.
And you spoke
In
Spanish
fact,
on that episode, I think.
well, I felt that I didn't want to treat her like she was stupid or an idiot or anything like that. I wanted her to have a life that they don't know about. This is a person who came from a fairly good home. She had a sister that was looking out for her and so on. And I felt people, we live with Mexicans here all the time, and people are definitely prejudiced. Some, people who haven't had the knowledge to know that Mexican people are as good as anybody else. So I was trying to keep that involved in it.
Yeah, that was a very memorable episode. Now, I said you also spoke Spanish in that episode, I believe.
I
Do
did, I think so.
Is that something you learned when you were living in Texas, or is that something you
Well,
just
yeah, I'm Irish and Luxembourg and Scottish and English. I loved my people, my ladies that took care of me, they were all very dear and very sweet. Maria, we went back to try to see her after I had grown up, and we found the house she lived in, but all of the children slept in one bed. She had like 12 children, and they all slept in one bed. So her life hadn't improved very much.
Mhm. Well, that's as I said, that was a memorable and moving episode. So thank you for sharing that
Now
experience with me.
that was my father had been an oil man, very successful oil man, and then the Depression hit, and we moved away from Texas. But I was born there, and my family was definitely not from there. But I grew, when we came back one time and I went to school, I loved the Texas people. I loved that they had, a kind of an energy that they were proud of being Texas and they wanted to do the biggest and the bestest of everything.
Mhm.
So I
Still
kind of
holds
was
true today, I
happy
think.
that I was from there.
Yeah.
It's a happy time in my life. I really loved those years, and I loved working with Jack. And I think we both, we had a kind of there's a time when he took me after my divorce and after his mess and everything. He took me to dinner with 21 men because I was working I was working on one of the shows, and one of the famous actors, I can't remember the name, but he was very famous. He went to Jack and said, Peggy's very unhappy. And Jack said, what about? He says, well, her husband's trying to get custody of the children and she's just very unhappy. He said, well, God damn it. And he said, I'm going to take her to dinner tonight. She could go to dinner with 21 men. And I'm going to take her. That's what he did.
He was
Now, is that an experience you'd like to try? Is that an experience you would like to repeat, or was that a one and done thing for you?
I don't care. It's a true story.
That's
but
funny.
he really seemed to from what you've told me, he really seemed just so fond of you and like an older brother. He really looked
yes,
out for you.
Yes.
He looked out
Oh,
very protective,
yeah.
very protective.
There was a fellow that came to work. I don't know if I should tell this story, but
Do it.
There's a
When
fellow
in doubt,
who came
spill the
to work
beans.
from New York, and he'd been in a movie with Jack. I think it was called, I won't say the name of it, but anyway, the two of them came to work together, and he introduced him to all of us. And I did my usual thing. I studied my character, tried to figure out how I could make it interesting, and so on and so forth. And this fellow kept following me around, and he kept saying, did you know so and so? And I'd say, no, I didn't work in New York. What did you do this? Finally he said, will you go to dinner with me tonight? And I said, no, it's my mother's birthday. I can't go to dinner, but you can come to dinner with us. And he's, oh, I didn't have that in mind. He said, so anyway, Jack evidently got in touch with him about all of this. I don't know that he probably was noticing what he was doing. And so the next week when I was working, this guy was working again on the show. And when it was over, he asked me if I'd go to dinner with him. And I hadn't worked in New York, and I thought, would it be fun to know what it's like to work in New York? So I'll go to dinner with him. And at that point, when he's taking me to the car, he says, Jack and those guys that you work with on that show, they all said to me that I shouldn't touch you, that if I touched you, they'd have to be answered to.
Good for them.
And so he said, what does that mean? I said, well, I guess it means what he said.
That's great. Keep him in line. That's good. It's a great story.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to scour your IMDb profile and try and guess who the actor was. But just kidding. We'll preserve the privacy of that individual.
I don't know if he deserved
hopefully though it was a good dinner, and it was just dinner. That's what. But
well,
great. Well,
it
you were going to say
it
something?
was typical. And while he took me to dinner, one of the men at the dinner place was an entertainer, and he'd married Julie London, and he introduced me to him, and he said, this is the fellow that's raising my children and taking care of my family. And that's
Was that
the way
in a nice way?
That's the way he was. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
He was,
okay.
it was sad to me because I'd just been through it, and he now is finished with it.
What type of radio did you enjoy listening to?
Well, actually, Orson Welles' Mercury Theater got me started doing radio.
Mm-hmm.
And I fell in love with everything that Orson did. I thought he was brilliant. And he was very particular about the people he worked with. Everybody that worked with him loved him as much as he loved them. It was just a big love affair.
Yeah. Now, you got the chance to work with him on the film Macbeth. Was there another time? Oh, actually, sorry. I think you told the story when you got called over and were kind of last minute put in one of his productions. You just strolled into the studio and got put to work. Can you retell that story for us?
Well, let's see if I can remember that one.
You were prepping to go on for a particular show, and someone called and said Orson Welles is on the phone, and you ran over.
Oh, yes. I had like 3 or 4 soap operas every day that I did. I played the lead in 2 or 3 soap operas, and also I did afternoon shows that were like This Woman's Story. they tell the secrets of their life and so on. And you'd have to, be that person. And those were very challenging to do, to keep them interesting. But anyway, I was doing my soap opera with Dr. Paul. I was Mrs. Dr. Paul, and I was in jail for putting too much sand in the cement when they were building the children's school. so she was pregnant with her first child, and she was having birthing pains while this show was going on. It was an amazing situation. I was in the studio telling my stories on the phone to different people from the cell of the prison that I was in, and all of a sudden in the rehearsal, the engineer stopped and said, press the button and said, Peggy, you've got a phone call. And I said, well, we're going on the air in 5 minutes. And he said, it's Orson Welles. I dropped everything and ran into the booth. And I picked up the phone and I said, hello, Orson. And he said, yes, Peggy, get the hell over here. And I said, I can't, I'm going on the air right now. He said, well, finish it and get over here. I said, we need you. And that was my first conversation with Orson.
And so you first worked with him on that radio program, and then later you did the film together?
Oh, when I was a child, when I was about 10 or 11 years old, I heard him on the air with wonderful programs that he had every once a week, and on at the same time as Charlie McCarthy on CBS, and I think he was on NBC. And I always wanted to listen to it, and my father always wanted to listen to Charlie McCarthy. So we had this kind of arrangement when we moved to the desert. I was allowed to listen on the car radio to Orson, but that was all. I couldn't listen to anything more because we had no electricity or anything.
Oh, so you would go out to the car and tune the radio in there?
I had to go out. Yeah, and the coyotes and everything were howling around me at night. I was just about 11 years old.
It probably added to the heighten the suspense of some of those shows when you're out in the dark. But they were beautifully done, and I just thought he was heaven. And I thought if I could work on his shows,
that would be all I need in this world. I thought that was
Well, you did
so
all that
important.
and much more, and I have many questions about the rest of your work. Going
Well, I just never got over that. But I started as a 2.5-year-old performing between movies, silent movies. That was how I started.
Yeah,
My mother was very concerned that I should not have to depend upon a man. And she wanted me to be able to support myself, whatever happened. So she put me at a dancing school when I was 2. And at 2.5, I was selected by talent scouts to be in something that was called a Russian prologue. And it was with a big orchestra, and all this went on between movies. You know, they were just beginning to have talkies, and so in between the talkies, they'd have this entertainment going on, and it was pretty exciting for a 2-year-old.
I can imagine. I have my kids range. I have an almost 2-year-old right now, and the fact of him dancing to any choreographed anything is mind blowing to me that's possible.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was going to say. When I had my children, they couldn't have cared less. You know, I put them in dancing school, and they got into recitals, but they didn't seem to care about them. You know, they weren't like me. I was just in love with theater from the time I was given a chance.
From the very get-go. Very cool. In a Time Magazine article or an interview that you did with Time Magazine in 1940, they mentioned how you would call up people when you get roles that required an accent.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's
and you would call to listen to the
Yeah.
dialects. What other things would you do to prepare for roles, both with accents or without? What was your
Well,
method?
if I was auditioning, which I usually was, I can't remember. I started driving an automobile when I was about 18. So prior to that, this probably wouldn't apply. But what I would do was try to remember the last person I spoke with in person or on the phone who came from the country that I was going to have to interpret with an accent. And then I would remember which vowels were pronounced which way and which consonants were pronounced and what the rhythm of this particular language was. And I would keep repeating it in the car as I'd be driving to my interviews. And before that, when I was in high school, I just seemed to have, I guess my mother was somewhat like that. My mother could do accents, and she was not interested in performing, but she you know, had fun with pretending she was different accents. So I think as a child, I grew up with that. And I would keep thinking about it and trying to remember the last person I spoke to who spoke that way. And by the time I got to the audition, I was usually ready.
Was there anything else that you would do to prepare for a role? Like were you in the habit of creating backstories or things like that?
When I was, going up for the Ingrid Bergman part in Casablanca, that I went to the motion pictures theater, where it was playing, and watched it over and over and over. I watched the way her mouth worked. I watched the way she turned when she was slowly coming into a speech, or she was emotional about something and how she tried to hide it, and different things that worked for me. And the fellow that interviewed me was from Chicago, and Chicago was the biggest radio network station in the years of 30 and 40. They had more programs on the air than any other. And this fellow had been hired to do the Drugstore Playhouse. And so he didn't know the people on the West Coast. And I had just finished doing something that had been publicized. I can't remember what it was, but anyway, I knew that I had to go against about 40 women in radio. And so I auditioned and got the job. And we did the show in about 6 weeks. It was every day, 5 days a week.
I'm sure that was a great role to land.
It was. And
sorry, I was going to say.
Unfortunately, the leading man was, I thought, wonderful in the part, but it didn't help him. The director had me audition with a lot of very famous men, and he didn't accept those people, even though they were probably better than I was.
You mentioned you watched that movie over and over, but to remind my audience, this was in the time pre-VHS. Did you just live in the theater? Did you buy tickets in bulk and just sit through?
Right.
Showing
I'd stay there all day watching the film over and over and over.
Was there ever an impersonation or an accent or an impression you were asked to do that you found quite difficult?
Well, I became known for being able to do that with about maybe 12 or 14 directors who had tried me in different characters in different parts. And so it saved them money if they could get someone who could double well.
The Swiss Army knife of voice actors.
Yeah. If you could double well, they didn't call them voice actors in those days. But what they would do, they were allowed at one point to play 3 parts and only get 1 salary. But by the time I was getting popular, it was limited to 2 characters. You were allowed to play 2 characters. So almost every director, in order to cut his the salary that he had a portion for the cast, he had to get people who could double.
No.
And as I said, in the early days, I would triple. But later, it was just doubling. So but it was very important that you be able to do that. And not very many actors from theater had concentrated on that. So the majority of actors who were working in radio were people who had been in theater in New York, usually, people who toured with plays. So they usually were not used to thinking about doing vocalese.
Yeah. Was there ever a time when the 2 characters that you played were in conversation with one another and you had to switch instantly?
Yes. Yeah, I had one part like that. I can't remember now. It seems to me it was a case of twins, and I had to have something different between them in order to determine which one was which. I can't remember what I did, but I do remember it was difficult.
Now
I think I had to make one list for something. I can't remember.
Now
they were twins.
Mm-hmm. What was your method for preparing for those types of roles? Was it just taking notes on the script?
In the heyday of radio, you didn't see your script until you got to the studio, and the call was not, you didn't come early, but you had to be there on the dot. Otherwise, you were reported to the union. So you had to just come on the dot. If you were due at 8 o'clock, or if you were due at 2 o'clock, or whatever it was, that's when you had to be there. And you had to have a pencil that you brought with you in order to cut the script and all of that. All it sounds so corny to talk about, but that was what we had to have. And you could get thrown out of the union if you didn't obey all of that.
Thrown out over a pencil. Forget to bring a pencil. Leave the union in shame.
Yes. I couldn't believe it myself.
Different times. Now, was there ever a time as your career progressed that you were able to make those kinds of crazy demands that I think are more myth than reality when it comes to some well-known actors, that they want, only brown M&Ms in their dressing room or something? Were there specific things that you started asking for that they accommodated you on?
The scale when I began working was 1941, and the scale was so much higher than I was accustomed to. I worked as a what do you call them, with the flashlight in the movie house? Usher in movie houses. I did that when I was 14 and 15, and you couldn't live on that kind of salary. But this salary, when I did like the soap operas, each one, the minimum was about $38 or $40 per show, and that was a tremendous amount when you were doing maybe 5 or 6 shows a day. And then the Dragnet show, when it was sustaining, paid, I think, probably somewhere $78 or $80, something like that. And then later, FBI became 100, and that was without negotiating. They just gave you 100 if you were on that show. And I'm trying to remember some of the other shows that paid very well.
$78, which is what you said you were getting per show, per Dragnet episode in 1950. I know it started in 1949, went beyond, but if I look it up and say $78 in 1950 is worth what today? Do you have any idea?
Probably about 200.
It says, according to in2013dollars.com, it's about $1,014 in today's money.
Oh.
So that was, as you mentioned, that's a nice chunk.
It was a very high salary.
Oh, no, yeah.
Well,
and that's incredible.
That sounds like a bit of exaggeration, because my weekly check from NBC on each of the soap operas was over 100, and that was for 5 15-minute shows. So it was about, I was getting paid about $3,000 a week
in 2050 in 1950 dollars.
Yes, 51 and 52, and when I came back from Japan and all of that.
Wow.
So and the big salary, the really big one, was when you had to do an impersonation on the air. Like Ken Murray had a show where it was called Which is Which, and the audience had to choose between the two screens on the stage, and you'd have to guess, the audience would have to guess if it was the real person or an impersonator. And I won for the for the director many times, so they didn't have to
pay out
to
the
give me
grand prize or something.
yeah. So, but I did win, and so that gave me a good toehold in doing radio.
That sounds like a game show custom made for your skill set.
Yeah.
Personally.
Yes, yes, it was.
Now, how strict were the scripts that you were given? Was there room for improvisation?
Only as far as the director wanted it to go. That's where Jack Webb came in. Jack wanted us to not handle the microphone the way we were originally taught to do. He wanted us to stand back, like sometimes six feet from the microphone or 4 feet. And he wanted it to be like we were being overheard. And then he'd maybe move in on us, which meant that we had to move in. But he would have us sometimes do a whole scene with 2 or 3 people off mic, which was very aggravating for the old-time actors who thought they knew what they were doing and didn't want to be told that they had to be off mic for a scene that was important. But he did that on purpose because he wanted people to have to listen more closely.
Now, what was that like with him being the director, but also a performer in each show? Was most of the direction given during rehearsal, and you just kind of...
Let me tell you.
Please do.
The first show that I did with him, that was called Dragnet, was directed by William Russo, who was a very good radio director. And I'd worked for William Russo on other shows. And he directed the first maybe 6 shows. I remember telling my mother when I went home after doing Dragnet, I said, that's not going to last. Jack is going to take over and he's going to direct. William Russo is not going to last. And I was telling the truth. That's what happened.
Now, what was it that gave you that impression from the get-go?
I could tell that Jack was very impatient. He didn't say anything insulting to William Russo, but I could tell that he was trying to set the style for what he wanted. And so he would do a scene with somebody, and pretty soon he was directing the scene. And that, that would hurt the feelings of a director who is well known and thought of top of the line. But I knew from the antsiness of Jack, the way he was acting, that he was not going to put up with having somebody tell him how he had to do it.
So that's interesting, because I always thought that Dragnet, that he directed it from the start. So when he got the green light, and in our past discussion, you shared that experience where he asked you to stay late. You did the first show.
Yeah, that first show was all men, and I don't know why he asked me to do it, but that voice was coming over the car radio all the time that I did. And so it was unimportant. But the 2 that he did for the beginning, as I recall, I think we did 2, were all men, and they were all the typical police and chasing the person that they were after. So it was not the typical Dragnet. I knew that he was going to go for what he went for because of the way he projected to me what he wanted. I could tell, and other actors couldn't. They didn't seem to get it with him. They get angry. They said, I don't want him telling me how I can act. And I think, well, you're being very simple, because this is his show. This is the way he wants it. he wants this technique used. And so I was very good with the common person because I hadn't had the experience in life, to think of myself as a wealthy woman or anything like that. I just always knew what the common man had to endure, what they went through with their lives. And he liked that. It seemed to make him very happy. So I continued to do it.
That's great. Now, were there any memorable on-air mistakes that were made by you or by somebody else? And then what happens in that scenario? Do people just, keep?
Well, I can't think of anything on Dragnet, but I do. You asked me before if I did the child in the thing with the BB gun.
Yep. Yeah, the
and
22
I was trying to
rifle.
remember because there were three times that he played that show. The first time we didn't have a sponsor, and I did it, boy. The second time they brought in a little boy, and the third time that little boy, I think, was the same one that they used on the second show. I played the mother on the second show, I believe. But I think he thought he wanted real. He didn't want an impersonation of a boy. He wanted a real boy. I think that was it.
That and so what was there a mistake during one of those broadcasts or
No,
okay.
No, it wasn't a mistake. He was actually thrilled that I could do a little boy, but it probably was not the kind of little boy,
Okay. Well, I'm just surprised that with the thousands of credits that you have, that there wasn't some time where maybe it was a mistake with the Foley artists or the orchestra came in late or something.
Some other shows. Yeah, there was a show I did with, I think it was called Coming Through. How was it Coming Through the Rye? It was an Irish show, and I was doing it. It was one of the big evening shows where they paid better than they did on soap operas and other things. They had a sponsor, and I was given the lead. And the actress who played it on Broadway was sitting in the booth.
Oh.
And she was now probably 75 or 80 years old, but she did it when she was like 30 or 35. And I had heard recordings of how she sounded. And I had a big argument with myself about it. I thought, should I try to sound like her since they're honoring her and she's sitting in the booth, And so I finally decided I was going to try to do an impersonation of her. But I think it was very wrong. I should have done it my way because she was trying to do it for the theater. It was a big theater voice, and she was trying to make it echo, and it made it false. It was just the opposite of what Jack Webb wanted. Just the opposite. She was doing it as a theater production would be done. And I was too young and too stupid to realize that it was not going to sound right on radio. Nobody, said bad things about me. But when I heard it, I thought, oh gosh, why did I do that?
Yeah,
not a good thing.
How regular was it that you would listen back to your own work, or later when you appeared in films? How often was it weird for you to listen to yourself or watch yourself?
No, I couldn't in the beginning of anything except This Is Your FBI, because it would be played to New York and then they would repeat it in California. So I got to hear the performance when I was in the car, usually going home or something like that. And it didn't help because I had a wire machine, and I didn't get it until wire machines became popular. but I got it when I was probably maybe 24, 23, 24 years old. And I would go down to the basement of the NBC studios and ask the typist if they had the script ready for Dragnet. And sometimes they did, and sometimes they didn't. But when they did, I would take it home to my little attic room, and I would play it over and over again until I got it to sound the way I wanted it to sound. So that was one thing I did that I doubt very many other radio actors were doing.
Now, for those of us that were born in 1988 or later, what is a wire machine? Is that like an answering machine?
But they were little tape machines, but they were wire. They weren't tape. They were just wire.
Oh, interesting.
And they were like an old typewriter. You know, you could see the rings going around as you spoke into the microphone.
Well, I'm going to go down a rabbit hole after this conversation and watch a bunch of videos on wire machines.
Well, they may have had another name for it, but I call them wire machines.
Well, I don't doubt that they were called wire machines. I just hadn't. Pre-tape is a mystery to me, other than
Yes.
very early.
That was I remember when I came back from Japan. Jack was doing the show on tape. Before that, we had to do it twice in the early days. But it began to be so that we could hear ourselves. But it did go through. We had many changes. When we played the show without a sponsor, we were limited to what most of us could do. By the time we had a sponsor, things changed a lot. People were getting tape machines and things like that. But prior to that, I had a wire machine. I started to tell you something that Jack said when he saw me when I came back from Japan. He said, "Yeah, we've got these damn tape machines now." He said, that was what I mentioned that story because when he came in, he said I was sitting there before everybody came, and he looked at me and I said, "How are things going?" And he said, "We're going pretty well, except for these damn tape machines."
Now, what was his beef with the tape machines? Were they just constantly breaking down?
I think he was so used to dealing with the old-fashioned way of doing things, he didn't want to change it. He had already made his imprint, people standing far off from the microphone and all of that.
I actually really like these little tangents where you bring another detail. It's fun. So please go down any path you want to. So since
I remember when Bart Yarborough died, that was a real tragedy for all of us. And he was particularly a good friend of mine because I worked with him on One Man's Family. And One Man's Family was my favorite show when I was growing up. It was a show that taught me what home life should be like, what families should be like. And it was beautifully done by Carlton Morse. And I wanted so badly to be on that show. And I finally got a break when I was 18. They put me on as a 2.5-year-old asking for Langendorf bread. And I had to sound like a 2.5-year-old. And from that, they began to give me really good parts. And I played Ellen Jordan, a very naughty girl who wanted to have a love affair with all the men in the family of one man's family, and Marty Arborough was one of the men. So when I got to Dragnet, I was home with somebody I was used to. We'd worked together for a long time.
That's very.
And so when he died, it was very tragic for Jack, because Jack chose him above everybody else to be his sidekick.
Yeah.
And I know that it really upset him. He died, incidentally, that first time when I came back from Japan, Jack had saved the show with a Mexican girl who had the baby, stole the baby.
Mm-hmm.
And he had told me, he sent me a letter saying that it had been a huge success and so on, because this was the first thing that I did with him after I'd gone away to Japan. So anyway, to get back to this, he hired somebody to be his sidekick who'd been in the show, but was not ever a sidekick. And it was hard on Jack. Jack was used to Bart, and Bart and he worked together very beautifully. But it worked out. I don't think, he said the sponsor did not want to do that show without Bart being in it. But he did finally agree
That
to
seems
do the show with the woman who stole the baby.
that seems so interesting that they would want to pull out as a sponsor. I mean, Ben, that the character of Ben Romero is a big part of Dragnet, but he's not the
Right.
only thing that made it a success. So it seems very strange that they would want to pull out at that point. But I'm glad they stuck with it. Since
Yeah,
all
what was his name from MASH? What was his name? The actor that did the part, I can't remember.
that did it after
He replaced Bart.
Okay, let me ask. I know those that are gonna, when they watch this replay, they're gonna be shaking their heads at me because
I knew him very well from working with him on other shows.
I'm gonna put this in here because they mention his name all the time in the comments. It's just slipping me right now. So I'm saying who replaced Ben Romero's character.
We worked for 3 years every week with Bart Yarborough.
Let's see here.
Before he died.
Initially, Sergeant Ed Jacobs, played by Barney Phillips, took over from December 27th.
Barney did the TV show.
Oh, okay. And then Martin Miller. Okay, hang on. I think it's probably just telling me the TV show. So I'm going to say, what about the radio show? Let's see.
Well, the TV show was the one where when I was getting a divorce, my husband was trying to take the children away from me, and it was not because he thought I was a bad mother, but because he wanted to make me accept no money. It was breaking my heart because it was just, such a terrible situation. The children were being dragged through the courtrooms and all that. I thought I've just got to do something. And I was in a big part on Jack's show. And this fellow from MASH was the sidekick. I can't think of his name.
I'm trying to pull it up. It keeps giving me TV information, but go ahead.
Yeah. At any rate, he saw me crying and he came over and he said, "What's the matter?" And I said, "Oh, I'm in a divorce. The attorneys just talked to me." And he said, "Well, that's a hell of a thing." And so he evidently told Jack that I was all broken up about this. So Jack said, "I want to see you in my office after the shoot today." So I went. And he said, "I heard what happening, and I want to give you my attorney. I wouldn't give him to anybody else, and I've talked to him, and he says he'll do it. I want him to represent you. And I thought it was so wonderful of him, but I already had been through 3 attorneys who couldn't handle the crooked attorney my husband had. And so they all quit because they couldn't deal with all the shenanigans that they were going on. And so that was why I was crying, was because I couldn't seem to find a way to straighten things out the normal way. I was willing to share my children, but I didn't want them taken away from me. I was a good mother. So it just, it was a horrible setup.
I'm sorry to hear that. I know several people who have separated, and it is often a very messy thing.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry for that.
Well, there was a lot of money, and he evidently had another woman that he wanted to marry, and so he already was set up to do that. So anyway, Jack, when he found out what the story was, said, "Well, listen, I'm taking you to dinner tonight." And I said, "What?" He said, "Yes, you're going to be the only woman at a party with 21 men at a banquet table, and I'm taking you along. You need to go with me."
Wow.
And that's what he did. God bless him. He was doing that to build my ego up and make me feel better.
Sounds like a great friend.
He was a great fellow.
Now,
I loved him. But I'll tell you what, I really was sorry I hadn't told you about the last time we had an interview. I have done 150 radio shows with the top performers that I worked with during my career in radio. And most of the shows are very brilliantly done by very brilliant actors. And I'm trying now, because I'm 99 years of age, I don't want to go in like a salesperson and try to pitch a show. I need an agent. I think these shows really are it's what I aimed for all of my life when I first heard Orson. And these shows are my dedication to the great directors that I did get a chance to know.
I would love to know more about your relationship with your mother, because as you've shared before, your father passed away when you were very young, and then you moved to Hollywood
Yes.
with your mother, and you were living in an apartment
Yes.
together when you got your first job in radio.
Well, that's true, and it was Bob Carroll who helped me. He was the fellow that wrote all of the I Love Lucy shows with, what was her name? Madeline Pugh was his partner.
His writing partner?
First, they wrote his writing partner. First, he wrote My Favorite Husband. I think he wrote that without Madeline. And then it turned into, I Love Lucy and all the different other names that they have for the show.
Yeah. So,
but he was a page boy in the lobby at CBS the first day that I came to Hollywood. He's the first person I talked to. And I told him that I'd been on staff at WOI and KVOA, and that seemed to interest him. And I just filled out the regular employment form, and he chased me down the street a little ways. He said, "Hey, you didn't finish this right." And I said, What is the matter? He said, "But you're an actress, aren't you?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "I think that's what you ought to be auditioning for, not for a clerical job." So he took me back in and he redid it. And About 3 days later, the phone rang in the lobby of this rundown apartment building on Sunset Boulevard. My mother and I only had the money from selling the car, so we had to be very careful of, and I wanted to be near the radio stations. So I sold the car for, I think, $100, and that was all the money we had to live on. So it was important that I get a job right away. My mother was going to try to be, what did they call him, Rosie the Riveter. She read in the newspapers about those jobs being available. And so she went over to one of the places where they hired people because the war was on. And she got a very, very nice job. It wasn't high paying, but it was enough to cover what I didn't bring in. And so when I met Bob Carroll, it was the first day in Hollywood, and I was quite frightened because I didn't know what we were going to do at that point. And maybe he sensed it, and maybe he sensed the fact that I really had been working in radio, and so it was not going to be a new thing for me. And at any rate, he called me on this phone in this raggedy place, and I answered the phone. Thank goodness I was there to answer it. Otherwise, I never would have found out. But he said, "Get over here. I put your name in for an audition." And so I said, "Right away." And I ran as fast as I could. I was 16 years old at the time. I just graduated from high school. I was a senior speaker, and I had a job at KVOA, the radio station. Didn't pay very much. It's like $5 a show or something. It wasn't union. And so at least I was writing scripts and directing adults. I wasn't just working with children. And so when I got my audition, I did one that I thought of while I was running from the apartment building to CBS. And it was something that I did in high school and junior high school for the amazement of the audience. What did they call it in school when you have, that word?
When there's a high school assembly?
Assembly, that's the word. Yeah. So I had been doing this assembly thing since I was in the 4th grade or 5th grade, probably. And it always seemed to please. And so I thought about it as I was running over there. And when I got to the door of where I was going to go in to audition, I said to Bob Carroll, who had met me at the main big glass doors, I said, am I supposed to have my own material? He said, "Oh, they'll give you something." And so I went in, and the man who was doing this worked for Selznick. He was one of the main people with the Selznick motion pictures. And his name was Ted Wick. And he said, "Do you have something you want to do, perform?" And I said, "Yes, if you'll let me." And he said, of course. And there were 3 women in the booth with him. And they sat there and they laughed and they thought it was great. And they came running out after when it was over with. And everybody hugged me and kissed me. And the Mercedes McCambridge was in there. And she kissed me and she said, you'll be very successful in radio. And the other 2 women were very well known. They were motion picture women who were stars in the 30s and 40s. And both of them were directing. They were doing a little bit of directing. One of them was doing Sherlock Holmes, and the other one was doing just straight dramatic programs.
Well, I was
yes, go ahead.
I was going to say the woman that predicted you'd have a great career in radio was spot on, especially at the
Well, that
age of
was
16 to see that.
That was Mercedes McCambridge. She worked for Art Obler a lot, and I'd been listening to her, you know, in San Antonio and Tucson, the different towns I'd been living in, and we could get the CBS shows, and it was just amazing that these people that I had admired so much were doing this. They were hugging me and kissing me and saying, "You're going to be a big star in radio." And I couldn't believe it. And then Chadwick said, "I'm looking for someone to voice Ingrid Bergman." And he worked for Selznick. So I understood that, you know, that was a big deal for that studio. And so he brought me back in, and after, as I told you, I watched Casablanca 7 or more, and I really was able to do it with my young voice, very, very close.
So how
and so I got, well, I was close enough to do it that the Selznick hired me to do dubbing on pictures, it's promotion mostly for Ingrid Bergman. And then I got the lead in the radio series Casablanca, which was quite aggravating to all the wonderful women who were great radio actresses.
I can imagine.
On the street. So there were about 40 really well-known women who were trying out the part. And then after that, I had to audition with many male people, stars. They didn't call themselves stars, but radio actors. And so I got to know them that way. And
cool.
I was getting jobs because they thought I was good. They thought what I was doing was impressive. And so they were recommending me to the shows where they were working. The directors that I never heard of were calling on me.
That's great.
So it was really, it was just, well, it was God sent. I must say, I prayed a lot. And my father died when I was 15, and he hadn't been able to work for about a year or so before that. He had a heart condition. And my mother was about 18 years younger than my father, so she was still a young woman. And we had a good life. And I tried to avoid going out with men because I didn't want to get serious with any man. I thought I'd better stay single until I amassed enough money to support my mother, you know, and things like that. So it took me until I was about 25 to think that was a time to maybe think about dating. Going out with men.
Well, what an incredible story! Moving to Hollywood, getting a job that quickly, getting into the work that quickly, and then being able to support both you and your mother. It sounds like your mother.
I even got a movie job, sort of, because Girl of the Limberlost was something that Ted Wick was casting. And that was being done at Columbia Studios, right across the street from CBS. And I won the lead in that. It was Girl of the Limberlost as a radio show. And Mel Ferrer had been discovered in New York by the producers at Columbia, and he was given his first job as a movie director before he became known as an actor. So he used to come over and watch us do the Girl of the Limberlost as a radio show. It was every day. We did it 5 days a week. And so I got to know him. I didn't really talk to him very much, but he stopped me one day and he said, "How would you like to do the movie Girl of the Limberlost?" And I said, well, that's unbelievable. It'd be wonderful. And he said, "Well, I think you'd be right for it. I'm directing it, and I want you to make arrangements so that you can come to my office and we'll work on it together so that we'll both learn something. I'll learn from watching you, and you'll learn from whatever I can teach you." And so that was the way it was set up. And I was a student at USC at the same time. This is what was so maddening. I was going to USC, which was way across town. I had to take streetcars and transfer and everything to get there. And my earliest show was 8 in the morning. And I had to, because I was an ignorant young girl, I didn't know about anything. And so I got myself in sort of a pickle where I really half the time had to walk because I wasn't getting there when the streetcars changed tracks and went in that direction. So it was kind of a maddening time for me. I was very happy, but it was maddening because I really didn't have the time to go to his office. I had a lot of schoolwork I had to do, but I really preferred to be in the film, not as a star, but to work in movies. And I thought if I had to sacrifice, my education, I would put it second. So he was very, very good to me. He took me to restaurants that I never would have gone to. He showed me how to ballroom dance, which I knew nothing about. I was a dancer, but I was not a ballroom dancer. And he took me to the biggest nightclubs and introduced me to the biggest stars who were there. He was so sure that I was going to be the star of Girl of the Limberlost. But he was new. He'd not worked in Hollywood. He didn't know the way Hollywood works. And he thought that he was going to have the say, but he didn't have the say. It was a fellow by the name of Khan who ran the studio, and he'd already made up his mind what he was going to do. He's a photographer that had been with Columbia for many, many years, had a daughter who was the right age to play the part. And so it didn't matter that the director wanted me. He said to me the day that Mel Ferrer took me up to the office, he was sure I was still going to be in the film as the star. And as we went in, this man was seated like Hitler on a platform so that it was up, his desk was up above you, had to look up at him, and he said, "You're a hell of an actress, but God, you're ugly."
What?
That was the first thing he said to me, and I was 17 years old.
What a horrible thing to say.
And I sat down and thought to myself, I'm 17. He said, "You look a little long in the tooth, too." And Mel stood up for me and said, "Oh, it's the way the makeup people," he said, "I took her in early and tried to tell them what I wanted with her, but they didn't do anything that I told them to do. And he said, I already know who I want. This Columbia fellow, Cohn was his name. And so he said, good luck, and ushered us out the door.
Wow.
Mel Ferrer was heartbroken, and I was heartbroken. And as we walked out the door, a fellow who seemed to know Mel said, "Hi, Mel." And then he looked at me, and he looked back at Mel, and he said, "How's your wife?" And I thought, oh my gosh, he's a married man. I didn't know he was a married man, going out to nightclubs with him and things like that. I thought he was single. I didn't know. And that was another blow. So it took me about a year to come back to normal after that. But he was very kind, and he said, you can come on the set anytime you want. You can come on this. That was important to people in those days. They felt you'd meet people and you got to know other producers and directors because they go and visit each other. And so he thought that was a good idea for me.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, very kind things to me. He said, all through the years, he said, I will always ask for you when I do a radio show. And he did. And then he also came to see me when I was working with Kirk Douglas in a stage play over in Arizona. And he wrote a very beautiful long letter. But at that point, he was already divorced from Audrey Hepburn. But evidently, he was looking for a daughter to take care of because Audrey Hepburn was a similar age group, I think.
Very interesting. Very interesting story. What?
But I must say, it took me a long time. I had to grow up after that because I really believed what Mel had been saying, and he didn't mean to damage me. He did what he would do if he was in New York. A New York director is in charge. In Hollywood, it's whoever runs the studio.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry that didn't work out that way in your favor, but as we know from history,
other things did.
Exactly.
Yes.
You had a very successful career regardless. We're going back to Dragnet for a minute. Were there ever cases that were, or scripts or characters that were emotionally hard for you to portray?
I can't remember any. It was the only show that I could go to and relax. I knew that what he wanted was what I wanted. It was the same kind of taste that I had. I wanted to make the show sound like real people, the way real people talk, not actors. And every once in a while, someone would say, you should hire, not Hans Conried, but Bill Conrad. And Jack would say, that actor, all he does is listen to himself. And after I married and went to Japan to live, he turned over a new leaf, and he hired Bill Conrad and all these people that were not the people that he swore that he wanted in the beginning. But he was smart. He realized that they were able to adapt and that it was not so difficult for them to sound real. It's just not something that they were trained to do.
Yeah, Bill Conrad is another legend of old time radio. He did a bunch of great stuff.
Well, I worked the first show that he ever worked in Hollywood with him. He was in the Army, and he was still in his uniform. He was being, discharged from the Army. It was towards the end of the war. And the very first radio show he did was with me. and it was Bob Lee and Jerry Lawrence's. Was it True Story or not True Story? It's my favorite story.
Hmm.
That was Bob Lee and Jerry Lawrence's show. And in the beginning, I'm sorry, I'm all stuffed up with this cold or whatever it is that won't
that's
go
fine.
away. I'm sorry I sound the way I do. But anyway, I had to cater somewhat to directors, but I didn't do it as much as other actors because I agreed with Jack that people who put their hands up to their ears to hear their resonant tones were not doing the shows any favors. They were not sounding like real people, but there were some classics. If you did shows that were basic from the 15th, 16th, 17th century, it wouldn't sound right if you sounded like the average person you'd meet on the street in America. So you had to be flexible. You had to think about all of those things.
Mm-hmm. Now,
you had to know. You had to know what generation you were representing.
Right. Well, it's interesting listening to old radio announcers back then. There's like a very specific way that they said things on the radio that if you tuned into a news station now, it sounds totally foreign.
And that's Jack and I guess we're the same. He was a little bit older than me. I think he may have been 8 or 10 years older, but our tastes were pretty much the same. So another funny thing was there was a music store across from NBC where they usually had interesting guests, people who were special speakers on one day or another, And one day my mother and I went in while I bought some CDs. I was recording some of my own shows on a little machine that I had. And there was somebody in there who said that they would read my mind or read my future or whatever, something. And my mother got kind of excited. She said, go see what they say. She said, go see what they say. And so I did. And they said, they told me you were working with a dark young man. This is before television. They hadn't seen any television shows. And they said, he's very successful. And you're going to be successful because he's going to like you. And I thought afterwards, was that for real? Was that just an accident? How did that happen? But my mother, she took full credit for it. Well, that was Jack Webb.
It's all credit to your mom and that psychic in the record store.
Yeah.
No.
But that was, that silliness, but it still rang the bell a little bit.
Were there any shows that you... Oh, go ahead.
Yes, go ahead. You started to say something I wanted to answer.
Okay. I was going to ask if there were any shows or episodes that you refused to do for whatever reason. Like either on Dragnet or other programs.
Yes, there were. There were some that were directed very poorly. There were some that hired actors that were not actors. There weren't very many of those. People in radio mostly came out of vaudeville and touring stage shows, so they were very experienced. They were not amateurs. And I felt so fortunate to work with some of the biggest stage stars and some of the biggest movie stars.
Yeah, I have a question about that. Where you worked with so many iconic figures in Hollywood, both in radio and on film. Was there any co-star or
Yes.
director in particular who left a profound influence on you?
Well, I think I told you Orson Welles
You mentioned hearing
is my
him.
main inspiration. Norman Corwin was my secondary. I would say Orson number one, Norman Corwin number two. There might have been 3 or 4 others that I like to work with, but those are my main first 2 people that I admired. And then Jeanette Nolan. Jeanette Nolan was mostly she was basically a stage actress. And Lorraine Tuttle the same way. Lorraine Tuttle was not the kind of actress that Jack Webb would have liked to use, but she was a theater actress. And when you worked with her, it was like going to see a great stage play. You go away kind of still shimmering and shaking from the excitement of the way she performed, what she performed. And I felt so lucky. Those 2 women were the best actresses I ever worked with. And Jeanette became my best friend. And Lorraine was very good to me. She came to my house quite often. And when I had little children, she came and brought presents, and Jeanette did the same. It's just beautiful women.
That's great. It's nice. It must have been so fun to have those role models and those mentors in your life to help you as you charted your own
There
career path.
were. I'm trying to think of other directors. Bill Spear was interesting to work with, and Bill Robeson was interesting to work with.
Bill Spear of Suspense, right?
Yes, yeah. They were both men with great integrity and with a great leadership about them. They put everybody at ease. The actors in the show, the musicians, the sound effects people, they gave you the feeling that you were chosen because they believed in you. And that, I felt, was a very important factor for all actors and for all musicians.
When did you feel that you had made it as an actress?
Well, I think I said to you the last time, I never felt I made it. I felt that I was on the verge of becoming a star when I married Dr. Shinsky, who was with the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission. And I hadn't gone out with very many men. I'd had 1 or 2 men that were home from the war, and they were a little bit crazy, and they scared me. They really frightened me. One man said he was going to shoot my mother and shoot me if I didn't marry him. And I kept it a secret. I didn't want to say it because I felt if it got in the newspapers, it would make me look very trashy. So I didn't want that to be heard.
Incredible
but it was
that
one of the motivations.
Sorry, incredible that a story like I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm saying incredible that a story like that would make you look bad versus the crazy person.
Look what it did. What it did to Ingrid Bergman. When they found out that she had a fellow that stayed at the house with Rossellini, it was Rossellini with her husband. She had a doctor husband. And she never could get over it. It gave her a bad name in those days. And everybody wanted to think of her as as the good woman, but she soon became someone that they used vulgar words about, and it was not her. It's really not her. But her husband was very cold, not an expressive kind of man, and I think that she welcomed Rossellini because he was Italian and probably very, very demonstrative, and she probably enjoyed talking with him and having him direct her. But it gave her a big pause in her career.
You've given me something to go research because I've not.
I didn't want the fellow that came after me was somebody from USC, and he later became someone of importance. The government gave him what is it, the roses? What is it that they gave you?
Well,
I can't remember right now. What is it they give soldiers, officers who have done commendable work?
There's a Medal of Honor if you're injured.
Yes, like with roses. What is it? I can't remember the name of it.
Yes.
But anyway, he was a fellow who was very well thought of at USC, and William. What's his name? The brother of the famous director in films, William. Who is the famous MGM and Goldwyn director? At any rate, his brother was one of the main heads of the department at USC, and so he asked me to coach this fellow in his part because the man who had been playing it was ill, and he had to go on the next night. So I coached this fellow, and I guess it made him fall in love with me because he was the worst nightmare I ever had. And other than that, he probably was a fine fellow, but he just went berserk, and it was crazy.
I love sick puppy.
He just everywhere I go, he'd turn up. I'd be doing a radio show, and the operator would call the booth saying, "Mr. So-and-so is waiting for you downstairs." I think, oh my God, I have to put up with that. And so that was the reason I got married. It was one of the reasons I thought I needed someone to protect me and my mother. But I never thought that anyone would act that way. That I didn't encourage that. I didn't flirt with men.
It's crazy. I've never been in our, as a man, it's normally me that would reach out and pursue women, and I have thought it's got to be just awkward sometimes when in reverse, because at least I take at least I have the option of I'm only pursuing people I'm interested in. Yes. But for a woman, it's like you're just hoping that those that are interested in you pursue.
This fellow was a nightmare. Yeah. I thought he was handsome. He was a good-looking fellow. And he had two brothers, and he introduced me to the two brothers. They were both mafia people. They were criminals, And I thought, I don't want to have anything to do with this family. I don't want to be involved in this. And he kept bringing them around and showing up at my birthday. I'd have it like my 21st birthday. He showed up there, and he wasn't invited. It was madness.
Oh my goodness. I'm sorry. I'm sorry that happened.
Well, it really did destroy a part of my career. And when I married the doctor, he was with the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission during the Korean War.
Mm-hmm.
And so he wanted me to come over to Japan. And I said, well, I couldn't come over for more than 2 weeks because I have running parts in these soap operas. I had about 5 soap operas and other shows like Dragnet, and, the different comedy shows. And I told him that before we were married that I couldn't leave my career. But he didn't seem to have any compunction or feeling about that. He was a brother-in-law of a famous writer in radio, and they invited me to go to the ballet with him as the guest and me as the guest. So that was how I met that fellow. But it was very, very difficult.
And you have 3 children or 4 children, and are they from your first marriage?
I had 4. One died at birth.
I'm sorry. Were those children from your first marriage?
2 boys and 2 girls. My first child was a girl. She was born in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
And I stayed there for 4 months. It was 4 months. And then I came back and did The Big Mother as a television show for Jack. And there are a lot of things that I'm still hesitant, to talk about because I don't. The things that really upset my career were things I don't think I will ever talk about because they're just very sick people. I think I was wise to not get involved with very many men. I probably was not a strong kind of woman, the kind of woman that would beat a guy down if he tried to do anything. But mostly the men that came after me were very well educated, men with high degrees and everything. So I didn't expect that I would ever have to be a rough-tongued woman.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, so as I've shared, I was born in the '80s, in the late '80s. So where I'm not from the same time period as you, but looking back
Yes.
on this era of history, it's easy to just kind of put it on a pedestal and like, oh, that was a simpler time. People were kinder. There was there was a time of higher morals and stuff. But then as we're listening,
I think.
Go ahead.
I think that's true mostly. But then when they saw an older woman with a daughter and knew that the older woman was out of step with the modern world herself. My mother was orphaned at 4, so she really had a hard time catching up with her era. And it just, I had a strange background. My father was an oil man and multimillionaire at one point in his life. And he was ill most of the time while I was alive. But he was the only man I knew. And I often said to him, Daddy, don't lose your temper like that. That's not good for you, and it's not good for the people you're dealing with. I kept, I was more like the mother of both of my parents.
Well,
He was orphaned at 18 months. My father was orphaned, and my mother was orphaned at 4. So neither one of them is a very good background.
Mm-hmm.
But they were well educated. My mother graduated from Texas Women's College, and my father was an engineer and was well educated. So he had hundreds and hundreds of oil wells. I think he had 400 or 500 oil wells when I was born. And my mother then was quite spoiled because he showered her with fur coats and everything that a millionaire would do, I guess. But then they had nothing to draw on. They had nothing of their own to remember, about their home lives. So it was a very strange thing. The most family I ever had were the people I worked with in radio. Some of them were the dearest, most wholesome people.
Mm-hmm.
Both men and women. They were fabulous. And some of them came out of the 1980s, What do I say? They came out of the 1880s. 1880s. My father was born in 1881, and many of the men that I worked with in the early days, like Francis X. Bushman, was a big star in the 20s and 30s in silent movies, and I worked with him in a lot of shows. But these were very disciplined men, and they treated women very nicely. They had great respect for their mothers and for the women in their lives.
Okay, well, I have just one final question for you, and then I'm just so grateful for your time that you've taken. But of all the things we've talked about, is there anything we haven't already spoken about that you'd like to share with my audience who are fans of your work?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Oh, I forgot we were recording this to be played somewhere. I was just talking to you. But, I didn't get to tell you the names of my favorite actors, but I think there'd be too many of them. So I probably shouldn't be doing that. But as far as the actresses, those two that I mentioned, I thought Jeanette Nolan was the queen. And when she was dying, I told the nurses that because I knew she could hear me. And she smiled, a big smile. They already told me that she was dying, and she had this big smile on her face. I said, "This is the greatest actress in the whole world. She always was, and she always will be." And she put this big smile on her face. She died very soon after that.
It's a very gracious thing to do for her, thing to say for her, and thing to do for her.
Well, I loved her dearly and thought she was a great actress. In fact, I know she was.
Well, thank you very much for your time. I would.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. And I'm sorry that my nose has been snuffly the whole time.
You sound great over here. I don't know what's going on, but you sound great.
I hope you can understand me.
Yes.
All right. I can't thank you enough. It was a great joy. Anyway, God bless you. Thank you, and I'm keeping you too long.
Oh no, that's okay. Thank you very much. Have a great evening, and God bless you.
You too. God bless your family as well. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye. If you like this episode, please support the channel by liking, subscribing, and sharing this video with someone else who might enjoy it. And if you have any suggestion for a future guest, please leave a comment down below. Thank you.